we have become more machine focused rather than patient focused, right? We have become more about QC being the end rather than a means to the end, which is amazing patient care, amazing images, optimized images is the end. And I think we've kind of lost track of that. I think that compliance has kind of become our default operating mode, and we have less time to optimize and to innovate if we're so hyper-focused on compliance. I started questioning whether or not some of the work that we were doing was, evidence-based, or was it simply an anachronism? Historical inertia is a real thing. We just do it because that's how it's always been done, right? Nobody is really asking questions about, well, how does this impact patient care? How does this impact image quality?
Welcome to Frame by Frame, Rethink Imaging, a podcast by Imalogics. Here, we explore the intricate world of medical imaging, aiming to dissect the field and inspire both professionals and curious minds alike. I'm your host, Chris St. John. Today, we are joined by Brad Lofton, a diagnostic and nuclear medical physicist who serves as Chief Executive Officer of the Colorado Associates in Medical Physics, or CAMP, where he's worked since 2010. Brad earned a BS in biomedical engineering from Texas A&M and an MS in medical physics from UT Health Science Center /MD Anderson, and is board certified by the American Board of Radiology in both diagnostic and nuclear medical physics. A longtime advocate for Physics 3.0 in community hospitals, Brad focuses on delivering the same high-quality imaging physics support to rural facilities that large academic centers enjoy. He sits on AAPM working groups for workforce projections and radiation education outreach, and his recent publications include a 2022 study estimating the size of the U.S. imaging physics workforce. We are excited to dive into commodification and regulation and how to make world-class physics accessible everywhere. Welcome, Brad.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me. I'm actually a fan of the show, and I think what you guys are doing with this is pretty cool. So very honored to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So just, before we dive in head first, just to get to know you a little bit, can you just tell us how you got started in this field?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. Considering some of the luminaries you've had on this program, I'm somebody of little consequence. So my beginnings are very humble. I actually stumbled into imaging physics because I was studying at night to go back to med school. I wanted to take my MCAT and be a doctor, right? And I saw a posting for a job for a medical physics assistant. It was actually the first of two positions opened up in the imaging physics department at MD Anderson. It paid more than what I was currently doing at the time. So I applied, interviewed. John Hazel and Jeff Shepard were kind enough to have sympathy on me and give me an opportunity to serve as an MPA at MD Anderson, where I worked for 4 years. But that ended up being a really formative time in my life. I was introduced to what imaging physics is about. I worked with just some really amazing people, including John Hazel, Jeff Shepard, Bud Wendt, Bill Irwin, Kyle Jones, a lot of people that had a major impact on my career. And I got to see firsthand kind of how they operated and how to model myself later on in practice. They also gave me an opportunity to take courses. And so from then on, it was just, I was all about it, right? I saw I could get a specialized master's degree in much less time than it would take for me to go back to med school, right? So I was like, this is kind of more my lane, coming from an engineering background. So that's what I did, and it was great. So I, as you mentioned, graduated in 2010. This was pre-residency requirement, so I got a job right out of grad school, and came out to work in Colorado for CAMP. And one of the founders of CAMP was just a wonderful mentor to me, Jerry White. He always emphasized to us that the imaging physics department, or the medical physics department as it relates to radiation oncology, is like the central nervous system of a radiation oncology department or a radiology department. We're the ones who know how the machines work, how these $1 million machines operate. and we can translate the technical into clinical practice, right? And so that was his model. He saw physicists as an integrated aspect of the department. We were not somebody that came in and just provided kind of, QC services and then walked away. So that was really his philosophy and mantra, and I think it served us well, and it served us well as a company, for sure. I've been fortunate enough to work with Camp on leadership now since, I guess, 2014 is when I came onto leadership. So had a really, I've had the vantage point of seeing how we've grown in that time period, just as a company, not only in size, but really in the way that we conduct our work, the way that we innovate on site. So it's been a privilege to be a part of that. But people in the field in medical physics may know me from the working group on communicating advances in radiation education on shielding, CARES. I serve as the chair for that working group currently, trying to carry on the amazing work that Dr. Rebecca Millman has started back in 2018. And then I also serve as the chair for the subcommittee on smart regulations, which is a part of the MedPhys 3.0 committee chaired by Dave Jordan. So people may know me from those two AAPM related organizations or affiliations.
Thank you for that. And so when you look at the landscape of imaging physics today versus when you got started, what feels fundamentally different from when you entered the field?
Yeah, that is a great question. I was coming out of grad school at a really foundational time, I think, in imaging in particular. Primarily, the visibility of the imaging physicist has increased dramatically. And I really associate that with two things. The MIPA requirement for accreditation for outpatient imaging centers really kind of drove the need for more imaging physicists in the field. And then shortly thereafter, I think in 2015 is the revised Joint Commission standards requiring more kind of direct QC activities and oversight from the imaging physicists. So I think those two things in parallel really kind of drove the need for more clinical physicists in practice. I think at the same time, there were a lot of enhancements to state regulations. I know Colorado has gone through kind of a churn of updated regulations, and they never come out with revised regs that require less of our time, right? It's always kind of more, right? So assuming that trend has kind of carried throughout the country to some extent, I think that has drove the need for imaging physicists. So I'd say number one is just visibility of imaging physicists in our space. Other technological advancements, low-dose CT, that revolution was going on while I was in grad school and kind of continued unfettered when I got out. So, I think that was mostly prompted by the NCRP 2006 report that just showed the, disproportionate utilization of CT as a dose contributor, right? And so all these companies started really driving toward the bottom in terms of how low can we go in terms of dose. And so we've seen a lot of advancements in terms of CT dose over the years, which I think has been good. And maybe we can get a little bit into that later. But at the same time, I think one question that we weren't asking at the time was, what is the overall effect to image quality, right? Because there's going to be an effect. Low dose is great. It sounds great. It's very marketable. But what is the unforeseen result of that in terms of clinical image quality? Other advancements, DBT, digital breast tomosynthesis, was really ramping up when I got out. So we're moving away from 2D, FFDM, mammo to DBT. And now it's state of the art, right? Everybody has breast tomo at all breast imaging centers, basically. Other things, and I don't want to be exhaustive, feel free to cut some of this out, but it's just reality, brother. It's reality. The reliance of image guidance in radiation therapy is a massive thing, right? We use image guidance for radiation oncology all the time. It has become an integral part of that department. Another one is image-guided surgery, right? We're using imaging more and more for complicated spine surgery. And I would add that in both of those cases, that's enhancement in the use of imaging, right, for the betterment of patient care. But these are also two fields where the imaging physicist has really kind of yielded expertise elsewhere. right? Either to radiation oncology physicists or to vendor reps. And in my personal opinion, I think that we've got to change the narrative when it comes to those things. Very quickly, utilization of MRI is a massive thing, right? Yeah, MRI is a very powerful diagnostic tool. It's highly reimbursable, and it's being used more and more and more, which is a good thing, but it also presents some safety challenges, right? We heard an unfortunate, really tragic case just a couple of weeks ago in the state of New York where somebody was killed because of, inadequate screening and process behind that. So, and then finally, I think we are kind of at the precipice of a golden age when it comes to diagnostics and radioligand therapy. A lot are coming online. And I think that the primary audience championing those is the radiation oncologist, right? So again, this is something that if you have nuclear medicine experience or background, this is an opportunity for imaging physicists to kind of walk alongside these departments to integrate these as they come online. I think a lot of times we just kind of stand back and let the tech flow without kind of guiding that process, which is really should be our job as imaging physicists.
Well, you say that, right? You say like this should be our job as imaging physicists, and then you mentioned earlier like needing to change up the narrative a little bit. And so, not to put you on the spot immediately, but a peek behind the curtain, Brad and I did a little bit of talking before we actually started recording today, and I would say you described, for lack of a better term, a bit of a personal crisis when it comes to medical physics. Can you explain in a little more detail, like what that crisis is and what were these moments that made you realize something was maybe a little bit off?
Yeah, I've described it to some as my midlife crisis project, right?
Yeah, it's a
So,
personal crisis.
maybe I have some other stuff
Midlife
going
is
on.
inconsequential.
Some people buy like fancy cars. That's not my style. No, I would say it wasn't a single moment. It was rather kind of a slow burn of observations, just really over the years. And I will add, I didn't know this at the time, but I only recently discovered an op-ed written by Dave Jordan, who chairs the MedPhys 3.0 committee. He published an op-ed in JACMP in 2019, so this was pre-COVID. And he actually has a lot of parallel thoughts. So I would encourage listeners to find that paper, reach out to me in whatever way I can get it to you. But Dave had a lot of great thoughts on this, and I only recently read it, right? So I'm thinking like all these stuff that I've been articulating, and Dave has kind of been circling on the same lines of argumentation, which has been really helpful and clarifying. So just want to plug him real quick. But yeah, it wasn't a single moment. It was kind of a slow burn. I started realizing that we have become more machine focused rather than patient focused, right? We have become more about QC being the end rather than a means to the end, which is, amazing patient care, amazing images, right? Optimized images is the end. And I think we've kind of lost track of that. I think that compliance has kind of become our default operating mode, and we have, less time to optimize and to innovate if we're so hyper-focused on compliance. I'm not saying compliance isn't important. Don't hear what I'm not saying, but I think a lot of what led my thinking in this is just, I started questioning whether or not some of the work that we were doing was, evidence-based, or was it simply an anachronism? Right? Historical inertia is a real thing. And I think that there are a lot of things that we do, especially on the imaging side, and to a lesser extent on the therapy side. We just do it because that's how it's always been done, right? Nobody is really asking questions about, well, how does this impact patient care? How does this impact image quality? How often does this fail, right? I think that's a thing that was illuminating, kind of my thinking. We emphasize at camp FMEA thinking, failure mode and effect analysis. So FMEA is like a risk assessment tool, and it helps us to identify potential failure modes in a process. And it could be anything. It could be IMRT for a patient. So this is really big in radiation oncology, less so in imaging. But basically, it helps to prioritize things that you should focus on from a safety and a quality standard by looking at what the severity is to the patient. How does this impact patient care directly? Is this something that if it fails, it could kill the patient, right? In therapy, that can be a concern. In MRI, that can be a concern, right? As we've seen recently. How often does this failure mode occur? What is the occurrence of this? Does this thing ever happen, or does it happen all the time? And then what is the detectability of something, right? If this failure mode is going to occur, what is the likelihood that we will identify that? So kind of with that in mind, I started like transposing FMEA thinking into a lot of what we do on the imaging side, right? And, I started asking those questions. If I come in once a year as an imaging physicist, what does that tell me about my detectability, right? Is that a really good sample size to notice if something is really off? Or if this thing fails, what is the severity of the patient? Is this going to be an inconvenience? Is it going to dramatically impact patient quality? Is it going to dramatically impact the patient's dose, right? Just asking some of these kind of leading questions. And then what is the occurrence of this test that I'm doing? How often does it fail? I think that was the biggest thing. Is there's a lot of, and I'm hoping maybe you'll get terrible comments about this, but I'm imagining that there are people, imaging physicists out there who are kind of like, yeah, there's some stuff that we test that it just never fails, right? So a good example, and we're kind of phasing out of this, but is linearity testing. And not all imaging physicists do this. Sometimes it's technologists. Linearity testing for dose calibrators. That was something that it was a required test by the NRC, but so far as I can tell, it was only due to historical inertia. It wasn't due to advancements in technology, right? Because when we went to DC-powered dose calibrators, it kind of, the need for doing that quarterly went away, right? And so that's an example of a test that never fails. There's others, that this isn't probably the time or the place to compile those, but some other quick examples are like spatial resolution testing for CT. Once you've done like for that protocol, image processing setting, right? That processing filter that was used. Once you've established that at baseline, we test it again year after year after year after year. But that's something that really the mechanism for that to change is very, it just doesn't happen. And again, there's going to be comments, right, that say, well, I've just tested one last week and it failed. And maybe that's the case, but I would push back and ask, how often have you seen that failed, right? Is it like less than 2% of the time of all the CTs that you do? So, it's stuff like that. I started, another good example is like a radiographic room, at least in the state of Colorado, is very highly regulated, right? There's lots of specific tests that we have to perform on a radiographic room on an annual basis. And these tests even have well-established thresholds, right? It has to be below 10%. It has to, coefficient variation has to be less than 5%. We have to test all these very specific things because, how a radiographic room works has been well understood for a long time. So we had some kind of insight as to operating conditions for that. So we apply those from a regulatory perspective and test it every year, right? But you take a PET scanner, something that's, I would argue, much more complicated from a technological side aspect, something that's used to stage cancer, right? So, a highly complex piece of machinery, and it's not regulated at all, right? Outside of ACR accreditation in the state of Colorado, do vendor QC, and that's basically it. And so I just started observing some of the disparity in these things, very highly regulated and then more complicated, but not regulated at all. And there was a dissonance there that just hasn't set well with me.
I'm curious, like with this balance, in your mind, how much of this shift is kind of potentially driven by like market forces, maybe versus scientific?
Yeah, so I think things like advancements in image-guided surgery, image-guided radiation therapy, I think were born truly out of trying to answer the question, how can we get more dose, right, to this target region, sparing normal tissue around it? Or how can I better locate, and if you're talking about surgery, how can I better locate, this area and cause minimal trauma to the patient, quickest access, that kind of thing. How can I leverage imaging to do that? I think these are born out of clinical questions. Not everything that we do is born out of a clinical question. I think, especially with low-dose CT, again, I think a lot of good has come from low-dose CT. We now have photon counting CTs, right, that are 30 to 60 times less dose than a normal Gen 3 CT, which is great. And the images are much better, right? Beautiful images. So I think those are good things. But sometimes I wonder if a lot of that drive was more kind of market-driven, right? The push to low-dose CT, how low can we go? I think I heard somebody say once, a very prominent names, when posed with the question of, have you guys ever asked the question, what is this doing to image quality, right, across the country? If we're going lower dose, what does that do to image quality in all these studies? And the answer was kind of like, we never really thought about that. We just wanted to see if we could get sub-millisievert CT levels, right? And then the question is asked, and then we can really look on fine-tuning imaging and stuff like that. So that was never great to me. Like, I think that we have to have like clinical rationale and some foresight as to what the consequences, unintended consequences could be downstream in terms of image quality. So I think that was a long-winded way of saying, I think good has come from the marketing aspect, but I think some things, I think there was just a marketing opportunity to get us there.
I mean, and like on top of that, I mean, at least from my perspective, private equity groups, it seems, are now owning kind of like large swaths of imaging centers. ROI expectations is changing the day-to-day of a medical physicist a bit.
So I should say, just as a disclaimer, Camp is not private equity backed. So I don't really have a dog in the fight. But what I will say is I think that private equity has kind of become a convenient boogeyman for a lot of imaging physicists, right? When they talk about commodification of our work and that kind of thing. And I would actually push back on that idea a little bit and say that we have kind of seeded the market conditions for private equity to really take more ownership in this. And what I mean by that is, we have kind of distilled the work that we do into a series of reproducible testing steps, right, that look very similar from one physicist to another. People get really giddy when the ACR comes out with a new practice parameter, or if there's a new MPPG put out for, how to test certain things, because it is kind of a cookbook approach to medical physics. And if there's a regulatory or an accreditation driver behind that, then we can like apply that, series of discrete steps very easily. And my work in Colorado may look very similar to somebody's work in West Virginia or New York State, right? Every state may have some different, a few different nuances and things like that. Maybe a lot in some cases, but I think it's kind of flattened the work that we do into like, it looks pretty similar from one person to another. And so then what if that's the conditions that we've established, right, as a community of physicists, right? We're the ones who have kind of been behind all this regulatory push to enhance our visibility, right? And also to make the work that we do more prescriptive. And in large part, it's been driven by us distilling the work that we do to a series of discrete steps, very prescriptive steps. If you're accredited in this modality, or if you live in this state, you shall test this piece of equipment according to these tests, and we're going to establish these thresholds associated with each. Well, if you do that, you flatten the work that we do, and you make the work from a physicist like me in Colorado look very similar to a physicist in Washington State or in Florida, right? It all kind of looks the same. And so if you flatten the work that you do, if you flatten our contribution into like a standardized form, there's even some advocates for standardized physics report formats, right? That's a thing out there. If you flatten that work, then clinical physics environments become more of a race to who can provide that work the fastest and the cheapest, right? And we make accessibility to level 2 and level 3 work. And what I mean by that is physicists will know TG 301, which talks about level 2 and level 3 work. So it's really the value added work that we do as physicists, right? It's education, it's projects, it's optimization projects, it's, true protocol oversight, it's technology integration. It's all this other work that we need to be doing as a community. Basically, what you do is when you say this level 1 work, this machine testing work that you do, that we flattened out, right, that we've incentivized an environment where now it's just a race for who can provide it the cheapest and the fastest and who has the prettiest reports, then you kind of take away the value that we could contribute to this level 2 and level 3 stuff, right, education. And I know a lot of people will say, well, that's the work of the in-house physicist at like an academic center. And I would really push back on that, right? I think that community hospitals, rural hospitals, I think they deserve quality physics work as well, including level 2 and level 3 work.
Can you
I think,
explain level 2 and level 3 work to me? I'm unfamiliar with those terms.
Yeah, so TG 301, I think is the number, came out a few years ago. And basically, it tried to define basically the work of an imaging physicist, right? And so it kind of categorized it. And I may be butchering some of this in summary. It's been a while since I've read it. But level 1 work is like the machine work that we do, the QC work that we do, that for the most part has an annual tempo associated with it, right? So every year we come in, we do this, this distilled set of tests according to accreditation requirements or state requirements or Joint Commission requirements, right? So again, it's all very similar, likely from one physicist to another. This is the work that we do for compliance demonstration. We leave, and that's it. Level 2 work is more like education, ongoing education, staff education, technology education, things that a medical physicist could speak into from an education standpoint. Level 3 work is all kind of value added projects, right? So an example of that right now that we are constantly working on in camp is using tools like Imologic's RDIM, right? Looking at historical CT RDIM data, seeing how we can better optimize that for different facilities so that we can get everybody on helical head protocols, right? Or if you have a dose that's kind of an outlier consistently for CT chests, how can we do a deep dive into that? How can we bring that back within kind of our operating threshold that we've established in time? So these are more like advanced projects that an imaging physicist might spend his time on, that I really think is the value added stuff, right? And that's where we need to be spending more and more time. I was complaining earlier about sort of the lack of oversight with image-guided surgery. I mean, that's kind of the Wild West right now, right? Because a machine could look, a C-arm could pass all the state-required tests for the Joint Commission tests and look fine. But how are they using that device, right? Who has done the FMEA thinking? Who has done the process mapping for using a C-arm in image-guided surgery or an O-arm, surgery CTs? There's more and more of those as more complicated spine surgeries are being performed. That's something that traditionally a lot of clinical physicists have stepped out of. And we've yielded a lot of space to, vendor reps and other people. But that's kind of level 3 type work that we really need to be speaking into from our expertise. But if you take basically everything that we do, flatten it out to level 1 work and say, this is really the only value that we provide because you demonstrate compliance and it's the only way, then you're kind of taking away access to the value added stuff. Because again, going back to the private equity thing, we've kind of incentivized this marketplace whereby they can come in, make it more efficient, make it more translatable from one side to another. And I'm not blaming private equity, right? I'm really not. I think physicists like to shake their fist and say, but this is kind of the playing field that we've created.
There's something about this situation that just makes me just be like, classic humanity, right? Like, I'm a restaurant guy formerly. My brain goes to restaurants. It's like, okay, level 1, I think of like your monthly health inspection, right? Someone shows up, checks a bunch of boxes, tempts all your food, and you're like, yep, this is a good restaurant. It's like, okay, you passed with a B. Do I necessarily want to eat there? Or do I want to eat at a place that's like, yes, they passed their health inspection, but they also spend like, they're also getting food from local farms, and they're training their staff how to do things properly. And then they're like testing recipes and trying things out and trying things on. And like that level of quality, like it's such a massive shift. And obviously, like, getting a cheeseburger is not the same as giving someone a CT scan, but it speaks to like the fast food nature almost of what's going on in physics is what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, you get the same quality right from McDonald's to McDonald's. We'll say that. I love your analogy because I think it plays really well to Dr. Sumay's analogy with the recipe, and I really love that. So yeah, I think compliance with regulations is often used as a proxy for quality and safety, but it's not the same thing. It's not exactly the same thing. It's related. And again, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not advocating for no regulations. What I am saying is regulations kind of represent the bare minimum standard, right? And we have to create an environment where we're incentivized to oversee and to promote that upward trajectory. How can we make this better? How can we optimize? How can we get shorter scan times in MRI without degrading image quality? That's a value add for facilities, right? Because they can do more patients. So we have to think, in terms of not just it meets these compliance standards that's been established. I've seen this before, and maybe this will come up again later, but it's funny to me how if in a lot of situations, and we do it too, I'm not like pointing the finger at anybody, but if something is not specified in a regulation, then it's more likely that we'll say, this isn't ideal, but nothing I can do about it. We don't have any kind of regulatory weight behind us. Like AEC testing for rad rooms is a big one right now, right? Because there's not really specified in like Colorado state regs, and I'm assuming a lot of state regs are similar. Like, you have to test it, but we're not going to really give you any guidelines on this. Well, we need to be able to come in and say, look, the balance for your AEC cells is more than 30% off. Like, you need to fix this because it could result in these issues for image quality, right? So thinking in terms of what the end result will be, kind of thinking in terms of FMEA, communicating that to the client, you're going to get grainier images. There's more likelihood of that you're going to miss something, and having that be your motivation as opposed to this default, is it in compliance or not, and then moving on. I think we really have to reclaim that as a community of physicists.
It's well said. You're kind of already touching on this, right? But let's say that commodification kind of frames physics as a line item cost. What is the story, like the value story, that physicists need to be telling to remain, indispensable? Like there's, I try not to talk about Immulogics as a product on this show, but like there's a lot of compliance tools built into the product, right? And so there's all of these hours saved for the physicist, right? What do they need to be doing? How can they be improving their facility? Like, what is that value story that they can be talking about in their facilities?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think for me, it goes back to what Jerry White used to say about the radiation oncology physics department, right, at a cancer center. We really need to present ourselves as the central nervous system in radiology. We have to be the problem solvers. That needs to be our primary responsibility. Quality and safety, not only compliance, right? That means leveraging tools like RDIM systems, QC information systems. There's lots of great tools coming online that we need to be able to interact with, right? And not limit our exposure to once a year. I think that's what drives me crazy, is the cadence of a lot of the work that we do is just, it's very limited. We've got to be able to have enough oversight that we're observing trends in time. I think that I heard somebody give a talk recently that was really good, but his point was, when I go in year to year to do a mammo test, right, I've observed, like, if you go back and plot, I guess he was looking at somebody else's work, so maybe this wasn't work that he was doing. He was called in because I think a radiologist was complaining about image quality for these mammo images at this facility. in whatever location. And he was doing some investigation, and he looked at the physicist results, right? Image quality results, dose results for the past 4 years. And you could see like a trend downward. Like there has been a shift at some point in terms of image quality. And so his point was we really need to be observing trends in our data, not only testing against the threshold, because the threshold test at the time was passing, right? But obviously something was going on with this MAMO system. And he made a good point, and his point is well received and true. But my counterpoint to him was, if you're looking at 4 data points over 4 years, that's not great sample size, right? So how can we get better information from technologist QC, right? That's done daily or weekly. There's a lot more data there that we can extract information from. And we actually have software tools to do a more in-depth analysis of some of this stuff so that we can be more sensitive to change from a baseline condition. This is going to be a controversial statement. And again, I'm sorry that,
I like that you apologize for making all these controversial statements.
Sorry, not sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to offer an official apology on Brad's part for anything controversial he says for the rest of the episode.
Yeah. So I testing is not physics. Okay. I think that commissioning, acceptance testing, characterizing performance at the beginning or from some baseline, really determining the outer bounds of operation for this piece of equipment, imaging equipment. I think that is physics. I think from that, establishing an ongoing QC program that's going to be sensitive to change that we can observe in real time, not just once a year. That's physics. Troubleshooting is physics. Identifying trends, these are physics. But just testing something according to this kind of prescriptive cookbook that we were talking about a second ago, I would argue is not. And here's why I would say that. I worked as an MPA at MD Anderson, and I could do a lot of these things, right? Because I had great teachers. I have seen in our own practice, we work with some really great field service engineers, right? In MAMO, they come in, they calibrate the machine, they test dose, they make sure everything is within hologic operating conditions. Some of them even know that I'm a stickler when it comes to artifact. So they know if Brad is coming, I'm going to have to make sure these artifact images look really good. So they'll do that, right? And they'll show me when I get there, like, hey, these images look great. So, but they're high performers and they can follow steps, right? There's a lot of technologists, CT, MRI technologists out there that could do the same thing. So I'm just making the point that we have to really be the overseers, the quality overseers, and we have to create that baseline and the monitoring conditions that we apply to that. That really needs to be our space. I think it's going to be better from a time management perspective, and it's going to make us more sensitive to changes. I have a MAMO site that was participating in the TMIS trial, right, that was looking at basically comparing digital breast tomosynthesis image to 2D images to see which is better for screening purposes, right? And so as part of that trial, they had to do this kind of extended version of QC. And they would have to, I think they had to do some daily, some weekly, but they had like a different phantom. And so one day I remember going in and getting called because this facility had gotten notification that, hey, the noise power on this phantom image that you sent to us remotely failed our, threshold boundaries that we had set, right? It was outside of our limits, operating limits. And I from what I can remember at the time, the images looked fine. The tech was like, I don't know what happened. But my point was there are kind of higher order, more sensitive tools that we can be using, I think, that would really facilitate this kind of QC management oversight model that we're not taking advantage of. We still kind of have this like, well, we'll go in once a year and we'll do these tests and we'll look at, a year's worth of QC data and then we'll go about our way. But if you're only going in to interface with this thing once a year or to interface with the text once a year, you're kind of missing the boat on something that could have happened 6 months ago. It's not ideal from an ongoing quality optimization perspective. I want to add a couple things to, you were asking about the new value, that we have, the new picture we have to paint, this new kind of vision. I think that we have to stop hiding from nascent technology that keeps coming online, right? We need to know how AI is being integrated in our departments. I think this is another thing that, again, I don't want to paint with a broad brush because we have not been great about this either. But knowing and understanding what kind of AI tools our radiologists are using, knowing what kind of quantitative MRI tools they're using, I think that this is ground that we've just yielded in our practice because we've been very on-site machine focused. And we have to change this because I don't know who's validating these software tools that are being used. Probably nobody. Are the results at one location different than another? Like nobody is really helping walk alongside our provider partners, radiologist partners and technologists to really help them integrate this. So I think we need to rewrite our story really as quality managers rather than just people who come on site once a year. I think trending is an important one. I don't want to be dismissive of the guy's point about trending over 4 years. I mean, he's absolutely right. We need to look at changes from a baseline condition. That's more important than this kind of threshold mentality that we have. We need to focus more on clinical image quality, right? As opposed to just looking at everything in terms of a phantom. Phantoms have a place, but we need to have a good enough relationship with our radiologists that they would call us and say, hey, something's going on. A lot of times they keep these logs of things that they observe in images that they'll give back to techs. We need to be in that pathway in a well-established sense. Because again, in that CNS, that central nervous system model, we're the guys who are translating technical or problems with technical, working them out in a clinical sense. That needs to be our responsibility. One thing I'll add, because this is a big talking point within AAPM right now, we really need to do a better job at communicating a risk to patients and providers, right? That needs to be the responsibility of the clinical imaging physicist. We need to practice. We need to know how to engage those conversations with techs. We get those from time to time. So just having a better response is important as part of this kind of like vision for what we need to be in the future.
You're talking about communication of risk, like to the patient specifically. And so you're saying that's by proxy through the tech? Is that through the radiologist? Are you talking about engaging directly with the patients? Because I can't remember outside of this job any time ever coming into contact with a medical visit.
I mean, it could be either or. We recently had the patient never called me, but we recently were notified of a patient who was concerned about the number of CTs that he'd had in the past 3 years. And he wanted to refuse this one that had been ordered. And it was for like a hernia. It was something, he should have gotten the CT. But he wanted to talk to somebody. The director of the department reached out to me and I gave my cell phone number. I said, this patient could call me. I'm happy to talk through this with him, right? So it could be patient interaction. It could also be talking to a provider, right? Talking to an ER physician, talking to a radiologist. I think that we assume that they are experts in communicating risk, and that is not the case. Some may be, but I think that we really need to reinvigorate the partnership aspect of the imaging physicist and the radiologist. We are a tandem. In radiation oncology, they have this really well worked out just because of historical precedent. Whenever somebody was being treated on a linear accelerator, you always had a physicist in the background, right, doing the technical the treatment planning, making sure the machine was calibrated, working directly alongside in parallel on a daily basis with the oncologist, trying to deliver the dose that the oncologist wants to deliver to that target region. We really need to mirror that as best we can. Now, there's a scale problem, right? There's a lot more radiologist patients than cancer patients in a cancer center. So, it needs to be more about the protocol, right? Not necessarily the day-to-day interaction, but we really need to try to reclaim a lot of that direct partnership ground.
I have to say, we never typically do this mid-episode, but I feel like there's so much that we haven't touched on yet. If you would be open to continuing this conversation, Brad, I would love to actually extend this episode past our regular episode length and do a two-parter. If that's okay with you, then to our guests on Frame by Frame, thank you very much for stopping by today. Brad, thank you for being with us. And everybody, please stay tuned where we'll be rejoining Brad for part 2 of this conversation. Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging is brought to you by Imalogics. Here, you'll find engaging interviews with thought leaders, experts, and patients, sharing stories that showcase the transformative power of medical imaging. To discover how Imalogics is rethinking imaging in healthcare, visit imalogics.com. Be sure to subscribe to Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And from all of us here at Imalogics, thanks for tuning in.